stay on When the upper house is filled with lords who inherited their position, when the upper house is filled with two senators from Tasmania having the same representation as a state like New South Wales, that was obviously an undemocratic system that you ought not prefer. First thing I'll set up is just to explain that this is a preferred debate, which means that neither team has fiat, which means you need to analyse how they currently exist in the current system, which means then, when I'm going to set up later that bicameral is a British thing and that has several flow-on impacts, that just is the system that it exists now. Negative cannot change how they exist. So, what does bicameral look like? We would explain that firstly, it is either inherited, so that looks like the House of the Lords, where people in that system, they come from father to son, it's not elected democratically. But secondly, the other form, which is more prevalent, is just states' rights. So, each state gets an equal number of senators. I'll explain why that's bad later. What does unicameral look like? We would just claim that they tend to be proportional, because at the point at which there is only one system, there obviously needs to be a greater desire to fulfill that democratic and representative principle, meaning that when there's only one system, there's a greater need to make it democratic, so therefore you would make it proportional. But we would also just explain unicameral governments tend to be newer. They don't have pre-existing lords that want to maintain their power like you see in England, which means that they are, they are more okay with having a proportional system. If you don't believe that though, it is just empirically true that a lot of unicameral systems tend to have proportional representation. First argument then about why we better fulfill democracy. Because we explained that the upper house just is undemocratic. Because if you inherit inherited-based political systems, that is just obviously undemocratic. But secondly, we just explained that disproportional representation in an event in which a state with smaller people have a greater say over a state with more people, that's obviously undemocratic. You ought not prefer that. But secondly, we would explain that it's a worse fulfillment of people's will, because usually elections are usually staggered between elections for the upper house and the lower house. And we would explain that the party that controls each house typically doesn't align. But we'd also just explain that it's often the case that the one party, like the lower house, is not aligned with the upper house because those preferences change. And we would explain that even if it's true that those preferences change rather radically, you still ought to exercise those preferences. So if it is the case that maybe one year they vote left wing, and then the next election cycle 2 years later they vote right wing, that does not a reason to believe that you should preference each of those democratic decisions, because those are legitimate democratic decisions. So even if they are rather erratic, you still all preference them because they are the will of the people. But thirdly, we would explain that people don't utilize their democratic right, because when stuff doesn't happen, because one is being blocked by the other, people get rather disillusioned, which means they aren't utilizing their democratic right. You get less democratic participation, which means you worse fulfill democracy on side negative. What are the impacts of this argument? The first impact is just obviously democracy is extremely important in that it allows you to manifest your fundamental principle of autonomy, because democracy is instrumental to your own self-actualization, because it determines whether the policies of education, the policies when you're in aged care, the policies on your tax breaks, all those things directly impact your life and directly impact your ability to control your body, to self-actualize. That is extremely important. But secondly, we just explained that when you live under a government, when the government has a monopoly on power, when you have to do what the government says, you obviously live under a social contract in which you have a contract with the government in that you have a say in what they do, and therefore as a result of that, they are able to do, the government is able to control your life as a result of that. On the comparative then, you live under Lords and Tasmania, that is obviously less democratic and less preferable, but secondly, you don't get those changes, you don't actually, people aren't able to enact their democratic rights, they aren't able to self-actualize as well on side negative. The second argument is just to explain why we get better accountability, because we would explain there are other checks and balances that the courts or governments can utilize. There are things like courts, there are things like literally electoral incentives to not be bad, or at least electoral accountability. And additionally, you're able to cross the floor if decisions are particularly bad, or if your party line is particularly bad. But additionally, we would also just point out in the counterfactual, when there is an upper house, that decreases the incentive to create that bill in its initial forms well, because you can just think, even if my bill that I create in the lower house is kind of bad, there's still this safety net of the upper house. So at the point at which you eliminate that safety barrier, obviously there is an incentive to have that bill done in its best form at the outset. So that's just to explain then that it's unclear that you need this specific accountability accountability mechanism, which is the upper house, when you have other accountability mechanisms already in place, but as I already explained before, it is the will of the people. It's unclear that you need that accountability mechanism in the first place. But secondly, under accountability, we would just explain that because you have proportional representation, each smaller party, there are just smaller parties, you don't have majority two-party systems in proportional representation because, you just allow the formation of minor parties because, like, I guess that's just how it works. I guess we'll recognize that later. But we just explained that at the point at which you don't have two major parties, you have proportional representation and you have a number of smaller parties. That obviously just means that, you have to have more inter-party collaboration. And at that point, when there isn't just one party that is, has majority and can do whatever they want, obviously that just means there is more accountability at the point at which you consistently have to cross the bench and, litigate with other parties and all that sort of stuff. The third argument we'll bring to you then is why you just have more efficiency on side affirmative. Because we explained to you that you just have less election cycles. Because you have less election cycles because you don't have to one election vote for the lower house and one election vote for the upper house. And we would explain that that is particularly important because within election cycles, each election cycle obviously you're trying to get them people to vote for you. And obviously that results in media narratives trying to scare people into voting one way or the other. And we would explain that typically results in things like scapegoating minorities and doing other sorts of pernicious actions like that. But we'd also just explain that election cycles are rather expensive. I'll explain why that's important later. But secondly, we would just explain that obviously you have less bureaucracy at the point at which you don't have that extra barrier in place. And again, as I explained, they tend to be staggered. So at the point at which you don't have that barrier in front of you, you are able to do things like pass more policies. Things like passing policies on passing policies, but also, passing supply in order to give governments the money to enact certain policies. What are the impacts of this efficiency then? The first impact is just obviously you pass policies that are directly important to people. You pass policies that directly benefit people's lives. That looks like, things like bills on abortion, things like tax cuts. Those things meaningfully change people's lives. And at the point at which you can get those things earlier, obviously that is something that benefits people far, far more. But secondly, you avoid riling up people during these election cycles because we will explain that the worst actors get further riled up at the point at which they are constantly exposed to this information, constantly told that there is an enemy that they need to watch out for, constantly told that, if you want your life to be safe, you should vote, if you want your family to be safe, you should vote for one party. Obviously, that just literally just leads to the worst actors hunting after minorities or going after them or scapegoating them. That is rather bad. But if you don't believe that, we think the other alternative that these the constant election cycles have on people is just that they're disengaged from the political system at the point at which they're constantly being blasted by political rhetoric and all that sort of stuff. That is just rather desensitizing, which means they do disengage from the political system. So the third impact is just to explain that when elections get more expensive, because you're running them all the time, it means that only the elite can run for parliament at the point at which you need to fund those election campaigns. But even if you don't believe that, it also just means that the party as a whole requires more money. So when the party as a whole is funding, individual actors, that obviously means the party needs to draw from a greater source of money. And those donors, we would explain, typically tend to be either people extremely rich people, which obviously have perverse incentives that can run counter to the majority. Things like cutting tax breaks on big corporations. But we would also just explain that it is corporate capture at the point at which you need money from corporations in order to fund those added elections. But finally, we would also just explain that you are doing more time campaigning. That is just time that you're campaigning, that you're not in office doing your job. That is time where the president has to show up to each of these elections. That is time that the president is not doing their job. That is particularly bad. At the end of this speech, what you should believe that the democratic principle upholds flies over every other practical impact in this debate, because it doesn't actually matter the quality of those decisions as long as those people voted for those decisions, enacting their democratic right. So it doesn't matter actually the outcome of these policies anyway. For those reasons, vote affirmative.
Thank you so much. First affirmative, first negative when you're ready.
main things in my speech today. Firstly, a little bit of setup. Secondly, a first substantive on why we increase representation with these like bicameral legislatures, and then thirdly, a second substantive on why unicameral like houses just create worse policy. Okay, firstly on setup. One, how do bicameral legislators usually work? We say like very simply that the lower house is traditionally directly elected, i.e. like through local districts, and two, that upper house is often elected based on states or larger districts, so often people in these regions still have common interests. Okay, on to this first push on representation. And note the framing here, which is that representation determines how people buy into the government, it determines how they engage with the government and feel heard by the government. And so we've got three main pushes under here. One, when we have a bicameral legislature, we avoid majoritarianism. What this looks like is that, what this means is that almost a half of the Australian population is concentrated in Victoria, is concentrated in New South Wales. Without the Senate, there is a disproportional incentive to only campaign about these areas, to only campaign with the interests of these populations in mind. And note that the interests of Victorians and New South Wales are vastly different from what people in Western Australia, from what people in Tasmania are concerned about. That means the government is catering to certain people and neglecting others. Now, Affirmative may come up and claim that this gives like people disproportionate power, like senators from smaller states in the US when we represent when we represent people disproportionately. But we tell you that like rather this disproportionately advantages like people who would otherwise be ignored, and it's pretty unclear why this is particularly bad, considering like that the agenda is often still set by seats from the lower house in Australia, which like often overrepresents Victoria and New South Wales. And so the framing, like all the policy that is coming out of the government, like ultimately sort of benefits these electorates in a unicameral system. And in a unicameral system, minorities are often completely ignored, which means that like we on side negating avoid like dominant groups essentially taking total power here, and it means that just people are more correctly reflected in policy, which we think is a huge benefit. Second point under representation is how we help platform minority issues. The framing here is that minority groups often are overrepresented in certain regions. Think of like Northern Territory in Australia, which is almost entirely Indigenous, and so on the comparative, like with unicameral legislatures, like Northern Territory is repped by 3 members of parliament in the lower house, and because like their issues are specifically concentrated in these regions, like they have specific issues that they face, like that can only be represented by the lower house here, and they're often like overruled. We with like our bicameral legislators give them additional disproportionate representation in the upper house, which is particularly good because it increases the representation of otherwise looked over demographics, and often and this weighs pretty highly because it corrects representation of vulnerable groups who otherwise would be completely neglected. Third push on representation is how we mitigate gerrymandering on our side of the house, which is to say that like when gerrymandering occurs, this is especially bad if there are no checks in place which occur under a unicameral legislative. Whereas in a bicameral system, you can't gerrymander states, and so people still get represented even if districts themselves have been manipulated. And so like this again weighs highly because people are often like very disenfranchised by forces beyond control. This allows them to exercise some degree of control. And it's just like far, far worse in the unicameral system because there's like a higher incentive to gerrymander. And again, they lose that benefit of people who are disenfranchised, feeling as if they accrue some benefits. Okay. Second point here on why unicameral legislatives create worse policy. So the observation here is that like political policy is imperfect, but we have like 3 main pushes on why it's just like fundamentally worse on side Affirmative. The first thing to note is that like unicameral systems often don't have very rigorous checks and balances, and so like First Affirmative came up and talked about how they have like a great deal of efficiency on their side. It looks like less bureaucracy, it looks like less barriers in place, which means that the government can pass policy more quickly that is like benefiting people's lives. We would agree with this, but flip this and saying that like what happens more often as a result of this efficiency is that when you are elected in a unicameral majority, you have the capacity to pass incredibly damaging reforms that often only support your party's specific agenda, and you can pass these reforms incredibly quickly. So that looks like, for example, New Zealand Nationals Christopher Luxon immediately killing legislation on Māori health when he stepped in as Prime Minister last year. That looks like Joe Bialki-Peterson getting like public service absolutely gutted in Queensland. Something of note here is that like these are populist policies that appeal to voter bases, and they're never truly in the interest of the country as a whole. And so crucially, these are just like specifically very damaging to minority groups who I've already flagged as being very vulnerable in this debate. Secondly, on why unicameral legislatures create worse policy, is that checking policy in general just facilitates better policy, and that happens far more on our side of the house than theirs. We say like firstly that it's good to compromise, because even if policy then is slightly less radical, the benefits accrued from passing like very nuanced policy will likely encompass like a greater degree of the population. Secondly, that this just allows more time for people to mull over the policy, for like for the public to like consolidate, and it just allows more time for deliberation, which creates more nuanced policy, which will likely just be more sustainable in the future because everyone has kind of had their say in it. And thirdly, under why unicameral legislators create worse policy, is that unicameral legislators just stop electoral checks and balances, which means that like majoritarianism gets increasingly worse, and most significantly, this like mitigates, most significantly under a bicameral legislative, it mitigates the worst like excesses of authoritarianism, which means that like we get this like control over electoral policy. Under like their system, they get this bigger control over electoral policy, which can essentially spur the rise of populism, which is obviously not the biggest harm in developed democracies, but we still flag it as being bad because this is particularly harmful in developing democracies where there are not as many norms. And we can look to things like the ANC in South Africa to show that like this is a huge impact for places where democracy is rising, and we want that to be something we support. So proud to negate.
Thank you so much to A, to N.
The threat of side affirmative is that we live under governance of Lords or Tasmania. Panel, reality check this. Australia is not governed dominantly by Tasmania. Only one of the last 10 Prime Ministers has come from anywhere other than New South Wales or Victoria. Note that when it comes to divvying up GST at the end of the year, it's still New South Wales and Victoria who get by far a disproportionate amount. We are not governed by Tasmania. The United Kingdom is not governed by Lords. It is almost governed entirely unicamerally. The Lords act occasionally as a checking mechanism, and I'll explain why when they do, it's actually quite good, because they don't often operate in the incredibly conservative ways that side affirmative likes to assert. Firstly, going to explain why democracy gets better, then accountability, and maybe if I have time, some sort of stuff on efficiency. But I think based on the affirmative way, it actually matters whether we get democracy in this debate. So that's what the lion's share of this speech will be spent on. The first claim from side affirmative is that less people have influence over more. Note that this just concedes that majoritarianism is a risk on the comparative. Obviously there is a disparity in power. This is actually not the end of the world, because we explained to you at Alissa to almost no response that these minority groups are probably not actually creating completely dominant majoritarian governments. Note that there are a series of reasons for that which makes this incredibly unlikely, because we explained to you that the lower house still sets the agenda. We explained to you that the lower house still exercises executive fiat. We explained to you that the lower house is still the one who gets to set all of this policy. And we explained that often what happens is you get compromises in the upper house, which one, give you better legislation, which I'll get onto a bit later, but two, just mean that more people's interests are represented in the creation of this policy. And note it was okay in this case, because in the comparative where you had one house only representing the majority group of people, you are most likely to exclude historically disprivileged groups. You are most likely to exclude minority groups. And when they tell you on side affirmative that this is particularly important in the developing world because that's where a lot of unicameral systems exist, I would note that this is often where ethnic tensions are highest and often where there is the worst risk of oppression when you have a majoritarian government. It was incredibly fine for us to say we wanted additional representation for these minority groups because one, it wasn't just overriding state power. It was not that Australia was being governed by Tasmania. That is simply like an untrue claim. But secondarily, it was just likely that the majority group still got a lot of their policy passed. I would note that Biden passed the Inflation Reduction Act through a Republican Senate, even though it's a $200 billion expenditure, incredibly un-Republican. Note that what that means is the government isn't entirely deadlocked. People's interests are still represented in bicameral systems. It just means there are more checks against the worst excesses of power and the less risk of majoritarianism. The next series of claims they make is that it's bad for preferences. I would note here that 1A gets up and makes the analysis that we would prefer more recent elections because they most accurately reflect the will of the people. And then the dunk on side negative later in the case is that we have too many elections. We represent the will of the people too much because we have alternating Senate elections and things like that. We would tell you that more frequent Senate elections mean that you get more active checks on government and more representation of the people. Because if the government has been doing things that you are unhappy with, you can elect senators from different parties who are likely to block the legislation you've been unhappy with. They are likely to represent you more effectively when we have more of these elections. The next claim is that there's just always blocking of this. I think it's true that Senates do block party legislation from the lower house, but one, it's not the worst case we have to defend, because obviously if there is a massively popular party with massively popular legislation, they get elected in both houses, legislation sails through, that's symmetrical. Obviously this occurs where legislation in the country is in a point of contest, where there is contention and not total agreement. I don't think it's particularly bad that we reflect a diversity of views in these compromises. The next claim they make is that this being better relies on this system being good. And I would note that they are deeply uncomparative and uncharitable on side affirmative, because they tell us that this is a prefers debate, so we have to operate with how it is likely to occur. And they only expect us to defend the absolute worst cases of bicameral systems, and then somehow refuse to defend Queensland, which is a unicameral, non-proportionally represented, districted legislature, where you get people like Joe Peterson, who gut the public service, who slash Indigenous rights, and who make life incredibly bad because they have a popular mandate from 55% of people to ruin the lives of the other 45% of people. We didn't actually think that that was particularly democratic. You didn't need to ruin other people's lives, and the risk of populism was always that you were going to do that. So, we just explained that on weighing here. We were more willing to have a slower, more temperate, occasionally deadlocked bicameral system that didn't pass life-ruining policy for a whole series of people by having the bicameral system. And secondly, they tell us that these are often newer democracies that use unicameral systems. I think this is where side negative gets an even bigger win, because these are often the least stable. They have the least other checks on government power. They have the least capacity to, they probably have the weakest constitutions, they have the weakest court systems, they have the most corruption. Note that unicameral systems there, like in South Africa with the ANC, were necessarily likely to tend to one-party majoritarian governments, which did not represent the will of the people. This was particularly harmful, because I would note, panel, that for all of the hand-waving and bluster on both sides, most functioning liberal democracies, bicameral or unicameral, often operate reasonably well. There are bad things that they do, there are bad policy. Obviously in this debate we defend improving them with bicameral systems. But where this debate was most important was in those developing nations, where there was the least capacity to check this power. Obviously this was where there was the most risk of ethnic tension and majoritarianism ruining people's lives. Just on weighing, we necessarily believe that this was particularly bad. The next claim they make is that you campaign to less people, but note this fails to interact with any material we bring you at Alissa to explain why you obviously still have to campaign to the majority of people because they are still the majority of voters. It just means you don't get to ignore minority groups. The next claim is, well, we don't give disabled people more. Well, I think we should. The better version of that claim is that marginalised groups are not always geographically located, but it doesn't actually it doesn't actually explain the difference in this debate, because it's not just symmetrical, it's not just that they are not always perfectly geographically located, but it is true, even if it is not a majority of Indigenous people in the Northern Territory, it is a vastly higher proportion than there is in Victoria, so it shouldn't be that Victoria and New South Wales get to set the entire policy agenda for the country. It was pretty good that we had that checking mechanism where you had a disproportionate incentive to campaign to Indigenous people in the Northern Territory. The next claim they make is that gerrymandering is bad under the United States. Epic, true. But note that this is a prefers debate, and we, as they like to keep telling us, and we structurally demonstrate that gerrymandering is easier under a unicameral system because the government also then controls all of the election policies in these cases. If you were in the United States under a unicameral system, the Republicans would get into power, they would legislate defences against gerrymandering, they would increase the power of gerrymandering, and they would rule forever. Note that it obviously gets worse under a unicameral system because we're comparing which of these two is most likely to descend. Next, on the question of accountability, they tell us that there are other systems like courts, no explanation as to why these courts are sufficient in most cases. Secondly, they tell us that you cross the floor. Again, just asserted that you can cross the floor. It was unclear why if your party was in the majority, you were practicing populist policy, you were a populist by virtue of being in that party, that you were suddenly likely to cross the floor against your own party. The next they tell you is that there is lower incentive to draft good laws. Panel, this claim just doesn't make a lot of sense. Obviously, it's fine to have a check on power where you draft better laws over the process. It was unclear that politicians had the incentive to make laws particularly awesome in the first place. Note that having that second check where you go to the and have them redrafted was just fine. The incentive analysis there didn't make a lot of sense. The next claim then is that the Lords override power and stop accountability. They're the highest court in the UK. There hasn't been a judgment from the House of Lords in 40 years. Note that this just is not an relevant and important part of this debate because one, the House of Lords doesn't dominate UK politics, but secondly, they tell you that lastly, they tell you authoritarianism is symmetrical. Panel, we give you a whole series of reasons at Alissa that it is more likely and more harmful, more probable on side negative. So proud to negate.
Thank you so much to M3A.
The problem with side negative in this debate is that their weapon cuts both ways. Minorities can be Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. Minorities can also be a group of really conservative farmers who want protectionism that will knife the capacity of the broader economy to do better and people in urban centres to be able to feed their kids, but will help them out, and they come from a state that has a lot of representation. The point is, either of those cases can occur, and it is a roll of the dice which you think is going to happen. Their weighing only applies if you believe they are good, left-wing, sympathetic causes. Problem is, they're not always like that, and they cannot structurally prove they are more likely to be like that. What does stand under that system is that in both worlds, what you are doing is trading off the rights of a few for the rights of many. That is, they say that majoritarianism is bad, but majoritarianism is a desire of the majority. And when people sacrifice their rights to the state, when the state has a monopoly on violence, when everybody in that country is affected by policy that the government churns out, I think we should always honor and respect the rights of those people over any others. fingers crossed hoping that a couple of good minorities are able to benefit from it from the end of the day. I'm going to start this speech, first of all, dealing with the accusations of majoritarianism and weighing it against the principle as flagged prior. Then I'm going to go through a lot of the more efficiency and checks and balances coded stuff later on. So they say that majoritarianism is inherently bad, and I would also note that majoritarianism is bad assertion is a little bit unclear. It's unclear why necessarily majority of people's ideas having precedence is really important. That is that they say, oh, it would be really nice if people with disabilities could have more votes. The problem is, if you use that logic, anybody who's affected by a policy should have more votes, and other people should just butt out of it. But that is not the system we have. Because that's not a system that anybody can trust. Because if you leave all decisions in the hands of people that you think are most likely to have them, you're unable to trade off with right. Which is why at the moment, pretty much every democracy does not give extra people extra votes. Maybe your kid, maybe you're a parent and you have kids and they rely on education systems provided by the state. Most people would not accept giving them extra votes because they have kids. A lot of these are comparable to a lot of other analogies, which they have to do a lot of work to prove is really important. Okay, moving on from that piece of frame, they then have three broad pushes. First of all, they say smaller states have different interests and we should respect them. First of all, that's an assertion. I think a lot of states, in the majority of instances, do have pretty similar interests, but what you're doing, for example, may be equally affected by different policy. As I flagged earlier, you may give money to one state and that means you're taking money out of another state. All of those are pretty important. Secondly, when they do, it's unclear why they have the capacity, the right to be able to assert that is more important over others anyway. And I think most people accept the basic model of democracy is people get a vote based on who they are, based on like the number, not who they are. Second of all, they say a more specific claim. They say minorities like Aboriginal people can get more votes. I think as we flagged earlier, this is an assumption of geographically based. And as given the framing we gave earlier, the proportional representation, because these are not descended from the British system, is the more common alternative that is used, and because you are able to capture more different groups that aren't geographically concentrated, what it means is that you could have a lot of elections where in 10% of the population is voting for like really pro-gay rights stuff. The problem is you'll never get a party to represent you because you never reach the thresholds to get each of those senators in, versus if you're able to pool your resources and now you have 100 senators and you get 10% of the votes, you must believe you get 10 representatives. That is the difference in this debate, which means that you should also believe that if you do have smaller groups and you want that interest to be represented, you aren't actually able to get that under their side, and so a lot of their benefits fall away. And then last, they say gerrymandering is bad. The problem is that even if you can't gerrymander states, you can still have gerrymandering in the systems in which states exist in lower houses. So it's unclear, as we give the example of the US, and I say, oh, it's just one example, it's not most meaningfully important, and like other alternatives are also pretty bad. I think the difference is that gerrymandering is basically something that occurs in states that can be bi or unicameral, and I don't understand why it is specifically the question of whether it can occur in the Senate. That is a tipping point for meaningfulness in this debate. Cool. At the end of this, the pushes here on majoritarianism really fall down. You should believe, A, if anyone gets any benefits for groups who are underrepresented and quite meaningful at the moment, you should believe that it can be a side that can get them represented where they otherwise wouldn't. But second of all, why do we think our democracy material is more important? And I think that's for the simple fact that we tell you these might be elites, they might be state represented, and they could be things like staggered elections. They say, oh, well, staggered elections aren't that important, you should be having these elections more consistently. I think the problem is that people vote based on the most recent information they have, and if you believe that your government's really screwed you and you vote left to try and protest them, the problem is you've still got a right-wing Senate. And what this creates is situations that we explain at first are really bad, which is why you get like the ejection of Gough Whitlam. Like you get situations where in order to believe that you have the capacity to mediate those, you must have the capacity to block them, and in certain instances stop that from being the case that exists. That is why, for example, having a Republican Senate has been quite bad for Joe Biden. All of those are likely to be incredibly effective, which means you do have versions, this debate must exist in a world where forms of representation in upper houses are able to override the majority of lower houses. That is a world in which those democratic outcomes are less clear. I would also note that the example, I've been told by Lilah that Joe Bjelke-Petersen was actually really popular in Queensland anyway, and it's unclear that the system would have meaningfully affected it. So, at the end of that, what do we believe? I think it's pretty clear that these democratic outcomes are likely to be incredibly these democratic outcomes are quite clearly affected more in a world in which you're not relying on this Senate being chosen in a way that can overstress certain rights over others. Cool. Moving on to the second part about like more practical side of this debate. I would say the new framing we get at second negative is like kind of weird, which is that new democracies have racial tensions, so you have to represent those minorities. I think you just explained a recipe for conflict. If you give minorities in a burgeoning state which has a democracy extra rights at the point at which they are able to meaningfully stop policy that the majority wants, I think that's a time where your democracy is more likely to break down. I think systems in which unicameral systems are set up are more likely to be able to avert that pretty bad and immediate tension that is likely to happen if you believe that those minorities can get representation in the first place. I think that creates incentives for really oppressive policies, things like trying to stop people from voting in the first place if you do have the capacity to do that. Then what do they say? They say checks and balances are really important and you can only get them from the upper house. They say things like, for example, populist leaders can use things like less bureaucracy in order to implement their desires and become authoritarians. I think also the problem with this is that, once again, this is a part of the debate that's pretty symmetric. If you believe that, like, for example, if someone wants to come in and roll back, like, everyone's rights, they needed, like, a supermajority to do that anyway. At that point, they're probably also on the Senate. Like, you can't overcome a constitution unless you have, in pretty much all democracies, so much power at the point in which you are probably landslide victory, maybe like Viktor Orban. Like, those are cases where at far extreme end of the spectrum. I don't think you should credit this weird authoritarianism material. But also, I think we say populism, as explained at Lilah, can spread really easy in those contexts. If you are a small farming state that has really powerful swing votes, you can be easily radicalized by someone who says migrants are bad and they're taking your jobs. That is also a version of this debate which works. Those checks and balances are unlikely to help. Then they say, well, you can't catch all of them through things like the courts. I think the problem is we give not just the courts, we give 3 other reasons why you're likely to be able to regulate these policies. That is, for example, that you can do things like have more considered policy in the first place, that you can do things like those courts meaningful in a large amount of cases. Counter asserting that just like courts don't work, I think is quite poor. I think, last of all, those checks and balances are likely out. I think this debate is really simple. I think negative really hedges their wins on trying to get a couple of sympathetic actors extra votes. But I don't think A, you should believe that giving people extra votes is inherently good, and B, that all the time results in positive outcomes. The side that can actually represent what people want and ensure that those are achieved is pretty clearly side affirmative.
Thank you so much, third affirmative, to finish the debate. Third negative when you're ready.
Panel, if you believed that politicians had good incentives to represent their constituents, if you believed that voters tended to be vote in homogenous blocks without diversified interests, then you should give this debate to the affirmative. The problem is that politicians do not have good interests. The problem is that not all African American voters vote in the same way and have the same belief on every single issue. That was the problem which we saw from this affirmative team. I'm going to do 3 things in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to have a look at this principle of democracy that we hear from affirmative. Secondly, we're going to have a look at which side gets more accurate representation. And then lastly, having a look at policy outcomes. Before I get to any of that, however, a few claims which I'd like to clean up at this point about the affirmative world. In fact, two assertive claims. The first thing they tell us is that under unicameral governance, you are more likely to get nationwide electorates. Firstly, note this is entirely assertive. They give us zero mechanization at anywhere on their bench for why this is likely to be the case. We note that, like, to the extent it's empirically true, it's because, like, prior to the globalization and, like, the rise of technology and, like, easy long distance communication, the reason we saw, like, the uptake of local electorates is simply because it was easy to elect a representative from your town and send them off to the capital to represent your views. That is no longer the case, so to the extent that unicameral government is a more new phenomenon, that is why this relationship exists. It is not fundamental to the structures of bicameral or unicameral government, and panel, we think that we can, like, sort of evaluate this in a vacuum insofar as we are arguing that bicameral government is preferable to unicameral government, not necessarily particularly in the way it's manifested currently in this, like, exact moment in time. The second then claim which they make is that, like, they see a larger rise of small parties under unicameral government, and I'm going to quote their first affirmative speaker, which is, "Trust us, this is true, we will mechanize it later." Panel, they did not mechanize it later, they gave us absolutely no mechanisms. What, like, you should understand and you should believe is that this is ultimately symmetric, right? There is no unique mechanism under unicameral or bicameral government for why you should get more small parties. Panel, both of these things should ultimately be thought of as symmetric in this debate. The opposition trying to use these as a Hail Mary response at third affirmative should not hold water. Okay, moving on then to this first key clash in this debate, which is this principle of democracy. It's brought up for you, like, very early in this debate. And, like, let's be clear, the goal of democracy is, like, agreed by both teams, is to get proportional representation. It is to, like, accurately represent the people of your nation and their interests at a, like, governmental level. To that extent, it is practically contingent then on the question of who gets better representation, something which I will deal with later. This principle should not carry principled weight if they cannot prove that they get better representation under unicameral government. So, like, moving on then to this idea of representation. But before I get into the weeds here, I'd like to address this claim that we hear from third affirmative, that is to say that majoritarianism isn't necessarily bad. Like, the reason that they give us, the reason that majoritarianism, is bad is very simple, right? Funding should be representative. If you have a, like, 60% majority, and therefore, like, because the government is majoritarianism and trying to pander to that 60% majority, they will funnel all revenue to, like, that 60% majority. They will overrepresent their views in government and in policy. Panel, this is bad. Majoritarianism is not an outcome which opposition can try to spin as a win or even not as a harm. It was awful. Okay, at a macroscopic level then, what do you need to understand about representation? What you need to understand is that the lower house, a lower house of smaller electorates, prioritizes big states, right? Big states who have a large proportion of the population. We talk about Victoria and New South Wales here in Australia. These two states gave you a 50% majority in the lower house of our government. This is, like, the interests of these states are prioritized in the lower house. In the upper house, it's the inverse, right? There is disproportional representation for smaller states. For smaller states like Tasmania, for smaller states like Alaska in the United States. What we think then is that if you have one house that overrepresents larger states, you should have another house which overrepresents smaller states. Panel, it was the two things in balance that created the checks and balances on power that was necessary to ensure good policy outcome and was necessary to ensure accurate representation, something which was very important in this debate. So what responses do we then hear from the affirmative team? The first one we hear, and one which they like to whip a lot, is it is equally strategic of politicians to campaign to everyone. Panel, this makes no sense. All I need to do to win an election is convince the people who live in the largest cities in Australia, being Sydney and Melbourne, to vote for me because I will enact policy that is good for the urban environment, that is good for these two particular cities, and that gets me elected. I then have absolutely zero incentive to waste a huge amount of time, a huge amount of political, social, and physical capital to go around and to campaign to people in WA, to people in Tasmania. There was no incentive for me to do this. I fundamentally wasn't going to. Also, we'd like to point out that a lot of the times there is just, like, conflict in what these two people want, right? When you are electing one prime minister, or even, like, 100 representatives, we think that there are more than 100 unique views, like, present across society, right? Like, not all African American people believe in a progressive agenda. Not all African American people believe in a progressive agenda. Because panel, just because of one distinctive characteristic of you, that didn't mean you thought the same as everyone else on every single issue. What this meant is that you had a sort of unique incentive under opposition side of the House to appeal to the largest majority, because that was enough to get you elected. There was absolutely no incentive to do anything else. Note this is responsive then to the claim which they give you about minorities. That is to say that under a unicameral government, there is an the nuance here which they try and use to prove this is that they can get nationwide electorates, and they say, well, with a nationwide electorate, if 10% of the people will vote for a queer rights activist, then they will get like 10% representation in government. We have a few problems. Firstly and foremostly, we don't think that they have the nationwide electorates they need for this to make sense. But secondly, and perhaps more importantly, it's a simple fact that like not all queer people will vote solely on that one issue, right? Like, they probably also care about how the cost of living crisis is going, something which like may make them be more inclined to vote for a politician who has been campaigning on the economy. Panel, they couldn't give representation for minorities in the way they said they did. Great. We'll move on to policy outcomes there at this point. AF tries to win on representation. Like, they try to say that because they get better representation, policy outcomes are automatically better. They didn't need checks on power. Like, I think we have addressed the fact that they don't get better representation. I don't think this outcome is really important. I think what we need to therefore look at, right, is the checks and balances which enable us to get better policy outcome under both sides of the House. The checks and balances which opposition claim that they have is the judiciary. The first problem with this is it's fundamentally far too slow, right? We think that by the time a case has been filed, has gone to court, etc., the bill has already been enacted and the damage has already largely been done. They also give us crossing the floor. We tell you at second that party dynamics largely prohibit this. But here's the crux of the argument for you, panel. What happens under opposition side of the House is all you need is 51% of the population to elect a radical populist leader who will then decimate the structures of government, who will then enact all sorts of horrific policies that endanger democracy and its future forever. We know that this cannot happen under our side of the House because you couldn't try and elect a populist leader in Melbourne in New South Wales, because at the end of the day, when you had a Senate which had checks and balances on this power, which universally gave more power to smaller states, these smaller states whose views weren't inherently aligned with those of the large urban environment, for those of small farmers, because yes, we did care about small minorities irrespective of what side of the political spectrum they were on. We were very happy to say that we actually got representation for white urban farmers, white rural farmers. What we stopped in this debate panel, and the reason that you should give it to us, is because we stopped radical dictatorial governments consolidating power. If we did this one time, that was enough to win this debate. So proud to negate.